I've been reading and speaking lately about sublimation, a little bit about sublimation. Sublimation being a transformation within a substance in which it passes from a solid to a gas without going through an intermediate stage of liquidity, and how that idea of sublimation and the various properties which accompany that, so for example when it's sublimed brightly, the substance rises and condenses in a different place. It becomes invisible for a while and then becomes visible again. It goes from a solid bounded object with weight and with form, with shape, through a momentary stage in which it appears to either disappear completely or take on a vaporous form, in which is not bounded, appears to have no weight, it appears to have indistinct borders, and then sort of reconvenes in an elevated position, again with borders, shape and texture and apparent weight. So those sort of properties are the properties which in some way mark out what sublimation is, and those tend to be the properties which are drawn upon when sublimation is used as a metaphor within the concept of the sublime in religion, in art, and in psychoanalysis. And I think I've already mentioned in psychoanalysis it has its complement in the form of repression, in which kind of the opposite things happen. I'm just going to point the camera over my shoulder here because I'm walking by the canal and it snowed last night, and there's snow on the ground, but there's absolutely beautiful thin film of vapour just above the level of the canal. It's absolutely stunning. Anyway, to continue, so that's what I've been talking about in terms of sublimation. But sublimation is quite a rare, it's a real sublimation, chemical sublimation. It's quite a rare event. We see snow melting as I am right now, and we see ice forming, sort of. We see rain falling, we see puddles drying up, so we see evaporation, we see condensation. Those things, I guess, are relatively familiar to us. But sublimation, in which solids disappear and reconvene as solids elsewhere, is rare. I've probably only seen it a few times in my life when I used to have a chemistry set as a kid. I know about it, but I don't have routine first-hand experience of it outside of that long ago experimentations with chemicals. So what's the status of that kind of an experience? One of the things that I'm thinking of is that there are certain embodied experiences, certain sensory experiences that one can have, one can give oneself, like heating up certain compounds in a test tube and watching them sublimate, which are very rare and which can only happen in certain circumstances. But once they have happened, and you've witnessed them, and you've been in their presence, and you've had all the experiences that accompany that, then they become part of your embodied vocabulary almost. There's probably ways of taking these things in sort of osmotically as well from the culture and from ordinary educational processes of reading and so on, but it's probably a little bit different watching a chemical sublimate than it is reading about that process, maybe. It's an experience which I'm sure was very familiar to this sublimation experience, but witnessing that was probably one that was very familiar to alchemists, early sort of chemists, maybe shaman, I don't know, possibly, but probably didn't exist much outside of that. But it does provide, as I say, a kind of vocabulary in which the imagination might choose to reassign the elements of that particular sort of schema, a little bit of a little bit of syntactic logic to the symbols. So it becomes possible, once we've seen sublimation and once we've experienced sublimation, to strip it of the content and replace it with symbolic content. So, for example, one can imagine that process acting as a kind of metaphor for, let's say, self-transformation. And here I'm reminded of that what's what I'm trying to say here? Of that line that you get in mystical practices, in which the deity or some representative of the deity says, I am become like a refiner's fire. And mystical transformation, spiritual transformation, is kind of mapped onto the chemical/alchemical process, in which that which is solid melts into air and then sublimates at a higher level, with all the implications of height that I've talked about elsewhere, to do with height and value, with height and oversight and so on. So there might be an argument, I suppose where I'm going with this, is there might be an argument to be made there that certain experiences that one can give oneself are generative of certain metaphorical uses for those experiences, which would not be possible if one hadn't had those experiences in the first place. Even if it's just as simple as watching some compound disappear from the bottom of a test tube and reappear at the top. It starts to, that knowledge that something can do that provides the schema for other sorts of transformations. And the schema would simply not be available to you unless you'd had that experience, unless you'd witnessed that action. I could probably generalise that out actually to other sorts of transformative practices, or other sorts of, let's say, ritualistic practices, for example, which could have that potential to act as transformative schema. I'll have to think about that.